Is Demolock worth it? Well, to you I say one word: explosive potential. What, not enough? Well then stick around, because in today's video we will take a look at the talents, gear, essences, rotation for Demonology Warlocks in raids and dungeons. But first, a word from our sponsors. Click the bell thingy if you like the video. Although our guides focus more on the basics and fundamentals, you will still get everything you need here in terms of builds and such, good enough that people clear the toughest of content with them. There will always be different opinions about more things that you can take, so keep that in mind. On the first row, you want Demonic Strength. The talent basically sends your pet into a charge and instant Bladestorm on the pack, and the damage is high enough that you want to use this on cooldown even in single target fights. It sims really close and actually a bit lower than Bile Scourge for me, and this talent is an alternative. The reason I don't always want Bile Scourge is that mobs need to stay in the AoE, and with Demonic Strength you also get to reposition your pet. The difference between the two is small enough that you can go with whichever one you want. Next row is Demonic Calling. Your Shadow Bolts and Demon Bolts have a 20% chance to make your next Dreadstalkers instant and cost 1 shard. The benefit of this is not as obvious as it may seem. The most important part is that almost all Dreadstalkers will become instant cast over the course of the fight, giving you the option to move in between casts. The most obvious benefit of this is during mechanics like, say, Volcanic in dungeons, where any cast can be interrupted, and having as many casts instant as possible will reduce the amounts of Hands of Gul'dan you will have to cancel. Clearly, the single shard cost stands for itself as a benefit to your rotation. The third row is the survivability row, if we're going to use one word to fit every benefit you can get out of it. Burning Rush will be your default choice here. You don't have any baseline mobility as a Warlock, and in raid you want a way to move from A to B, and that should be done quick, and this is the quickest and most reliable ways. The alternative would be Demon Skin if you don't have to move as much, since you will gain a stronger shield and overall tankiness, making you less likely to die to mechanics and helping your healer keep you up from taking mandatory group damage. The fourth row gives you Soul Strike as an added shard generation, damage dealing and pet control as well. Yes, it makes your pet charge the mob, which increases pet uptime if you have to switch targets. Although realistically you won't use this much that way anyway. It's a simple shard generation that you can use during high movement phases and normal movement phases as well. It might not seem as much to have an instant spell, but every little bit counts, and adding them up will make it matter a lot in the end, since with this you essentially are at 3 extra instant cast spells that are part of your rotation. Bigger picture gives you better perspective. The fifth row is a utility row, and here you essentially have free reign to pick whatever. Personally, I have started to play more and more with Demonic Circle. Take a while to get used to it, but once you're able to exploit this, man, good luck dying to mechanics then. Mortal Coil is the dungeon alternative, and I say dungeon because it doesn't have almost any uses in raids. Mortal Coil is a strong CC that fears the target instantly and heals you a bit. This is good to interrupt certain casts or to peel mobs off of yourself or party member. The sixth row gives you Soul Conduit. Nothing clever to say here. The talents are made to seemingly scale differently with gear. Soul Conduit scales the best the more haste you have, and the more gear you have, the more haste you end up having, hence the better this is. Not to mention that as a general rule, it's always good to cast as fewer Shadow Bolts as possible, meaning you get to move a lot more, so it's good. Last row, Demonic Consumption is the name of the game. Unfortunately, not even now is Nether Portal good. Not only does it sim bad, it aligns so bad with the other cooldowns that you have. Demonic Consumption, on the other hand, synergizes really well with the Azerite traits and essences that you'll be using, and we will talk about that in a bit. It's difficult to talk about stats without mentioning the explosive potential Azerite trait. This baby will give you massive amounts of haste, haste being an important stat. So without making it too complicated, the general stat priority is haste at the top, with mastery also at the top, kind of tied between the two, and intellect and crit following shortly after if you don't have this trait. If you do get a trait, however, haste itself becomes weaker because you already are getting massive amounts of it from the trait. As such, mastery becomes the best with crit tied for the top spot. Then you can look at intellect and lastly haste. You might have noticed versatility is really at the bottom in both situations. The stat priority you got is a reference more than anything, and even if one stat is stronger, doesn't mean the other is bad. As an example, I simmed my own stats, and my stats look like this because I have 1% versatility, meaning very low amounts of it. The point of this is to make you understand that until the system changes, if you want to get 100% out of your warlock, you'll need to sim. For the trinkets though, the stats will most likely help you with dungeon drops, which unfortunately are very inferior to the raid ones, at least for this tier. That's why I recommend you aim for Azara's Font of Power as your first best in slot. It's the kind of trinket you pop before the fight to get the full channel and intellect out of it. Next up is the Leviathan's Lure from the second raid boss. This trinket functions really well with specs that favor haste above all else, of which Demonology is one. It's not a complicated trinket, it just deals massive damage. The third option drops from the first boss actually, and it's the Shiver Venom Sack. This works even better in AoE, but can still be a valid option in single target fights, if you're missing one of the above. Now let's take a look at the traits and the first reason Demonology is so good. There are actually two builds available for demos. One is focused more on raiding since it excels at pure single target damage, while the other drops a bit of single target for massive AoE. The raid build sees you take Baleful Invocation 3 times. This one increases your tyrant's damage by a flat amount and gives you 5 shards after you summon your tyrant. The 5 shards bit obviously does not scale up and stack, but the damage does, and this becomes super good with a specific essence soon to be disclosed. The other traits should ideally be Supreme Commander 2 times and Demonic Meteor once. The Supreme Commander one buffs you once you are outside of the cooldown window, with the intellect buff being the only one that stacks. The Demonic Meteor is taken once for the soul shard generation. This works really well when paired up with high haste levels, meaning a lot of Hand of Gul'dan casts, and all your other shard refunding options for the arguments stated before. The aim of this build is to play around your tyrant, making it super strong and not dropping your DPS too much while outside of it. And most of these are good because you will cast your tyrant very often. The dungeons build, and admittedly the more fun build to play, sees you stack explosive potential 3 times. This trait is so good that you can and will have 100% uptime on the haste buff even in single target. Yes, you will implode at least 3 imps every time the buff is about to drop to keep it up. You want your second trait to be Baleful Invocation, stacked at least 2 times, and 1 Demonic Meteor. Between Baleful and Explosive Potential, you want to stack them as much as you can, especially in the lack of any trait mentioned here. You can, however, fit in a Supreme Commander if you're lacking any of the traits, and top Warlocks seem to prefer that even instead of stacking Explosive and Baleful 3 times. So there is some liberty here. Lastly, the essences are also split into 2 builds. Raiding and Mythics, and I believe it's only because the Raid Essence Condensed Life Force is such a strong single target option that trumps all other by a decent margin, with one exception. Your minors will be Memory of Lucid Dreams and Vision of Perfection for that reduced Tyrant cooldown. The dungeon build, and my favorite, that you can also take in raids, gives you Vision of Perfection as a major, Memory of Lucid Dreams, and Essence of the Focusing Arrows as minors. And to be completely honest with you, there are more mythic raiders taking this particular build in raids than the other way around. I did include the previous one for people that don't want to run Mechagon or simply do not like the randomness of Vision of Perfection as a major. The purpose of the miners are to give you haste and shard generation, while vision completes the build that focuses very heavily on the tyrant usage, and once you have it in your main, your tyrant will proc making use of your Azerite traits as well, although at a reduced power when it procs randomly. But I'm telling you, you haven't played ranged DPS until you had 3 tyrants out, that's for sure. But if you don't believe me, check our stream at twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline. Yep, we stream different specs and play mythic keys and sometimes raids with you guys, the viewers. So catch us streaming, and we do EU and US as well, so there's always a place for some of you, all of you, maybe all of you? When opening in single target, most of the times without the explosive potential trait, you start with a pre-pot and a hard-casted Demon Bolt into a Soul Strike for the damage. Cast Dreadstalkers after. Cast 2 Shadow Bolts next. Cast your first Hand of Gul'dan, then a Shadow Bolt, then another hand, then Demonic Strength, and then the Tyrant. A few mentions here. The reason you cast Demonic Strength is to fit in a global that gives your imps time to spawn, since if you cast Tyrant instantly after your hand, the demon will not eat the last spawned imp, depending on your haste levels. Also, the point is to fit in 2 packs of imps into your Tyrant's consumption. You don't have to cast as many Shadow Bolts if your Hand of Gul'dan has generated shards in return, as long as both hands are casted with 3 shards as quickly as possible, since the Tyrant's damage is not based on the number of imps, but rather their collective energy pool, which they consume every time they launch their little firebolts at the enemy. So the longer they stay out, the weaker your Tyrant will become. The Soul Strike is something I struggled with. The community and resources I found don't really mention it, and logic dictates you don't want to waste shards, which you do if you cast it in the opener, like I said, but no matter how many times I sim it, the damage is bigger by using it that way than waiting for it to be used in place of a Shadow Bolt. You can make your own choice, but I have explained mine. If you do have explosive potential, the opener changes very slightly. You still pre-pot and pre-cast Demon Bolt. This time you followed with a Hand of Gul'dan and 3 Shadow Bolts. After that you implode for the haste buff. Call Dreadstalkers next. Shadow Bolt twice, then a Hand of Gul'dan. Shadow Bolt once, then another hand. Demonic Strength, and then Tyrant. Previous arguments remain here as well, with the addition that besides the initial goal of getting to 5 shards, you want the implosion buff to be on you through the entire opener sequence, or as much as you can manage it for. When simply looking at the priority for single target outside the opener, implosion is number 1 if you have the explosive potential trait, and if not, you ignore this step. Next up is Demonic Strength on cooldown. Call Dreadstalkers on cooldown. Hand of Gul'dan when at 4 shards or more, Demon Bolt with at least 2 stacks of Demonic Core, Hand of Gul'dan if at 3 shards, and fill in with Soul Strikes and Shadow Bolts. Not much to say here instead of keeping 100% uptime on the explosive potential buff if you are running with it. In AoE, the most important spell to cast is Implosion for the haste buff if it's about to drop or it's not on you just yet. Next up, call Dreadstalkers followed by Demonic Strength on cooldown. Soul Strike whenever available, Hand of Gul'dan at 4 or 5 shards, Implosion when you have 2 or 3 packs of imps out, Demon Bolt at 3 charges of Demonic Cores, and fill in with Shadow Bolts. There will always be math and differing opinions about the best way to use Implosion. The overall consensus is that you want to use it with 3 or 2 packs of imps. Also, the AoE rotation will change based on your Implosion buff, how often you have to move, and things like this. These decisions rely a lot on you and the encounter, so don't feel too tied up in this priority, since the most important thing is the ABC. Always be casting. Consumables. We talked about the stats, and whatever is highest for you will be the one to determine your enchants and gems and stuff. As an example, I will be using Mastery as a point of reference, but feel free to adjust and replace accordingly. A Chord of Mastery and Masterful Sea Current will be your ring enchants and gems of choice, although you should still take one Leviathan's Eye of Intellect in one socket. 120 Intellect is still better than any 50 of any secondary stats. Your weapon gets Machinist Brilliance. This will perform well at all times since it adjusts your procs based on your highest secondary stats. Flask of the Endless Fathoms clearly, and Potion of Unbridled Fury for high single target pressure. AoE or more than one target, Superior Battle Potion of Intellect will pull ahead. Eat Feast since the raw intellect amount is Bis, or go with the Abyssal Fried Risole or the best stat food you have available and you should be Gucci. We covered everything that we believe to be the most essential fundamentals for you to take and use your Warlock Demonology, of course, into dungeons and raids and even difficult content. But hey, there's a lot more to go into Demonology and a lot of choices that you can alter, and the best place to look all of that up is the Council of the Black Harvest. Shout out to all of you amazing Warlocks there that have done some crazy theory crafting and have gone more in depth and over some advanced tips into what makes Demonology what it is. So I would recommend you go check those boys out. And of course, a special shout out to our boys and gals in our Patreon club. Guys, you're supporting us so much and we really appreciate you. Every time we say this in every video, it doesn't diminish the fact that we love you so much, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much. And also we have merch in our description video, as well as links to other pages that you can support us if you feel like it. So check down below. Thank you so much for watching the video. Take care and see you in the next one.